Welcome, and today we drift back into the shadowed corridors of history where the lives of the wealthy in medieval times reveal secrets rarely spoken. Together, we will explore a world of grand castles, lavish feasts, and glittering luxury, but also of hidden dangers, unseen burdens, and the quiet weight of responsibility that accompanied every privilege. So, settle in, let your mind wander, and allow the story to unfold as we step into a past, both magnificent and perilous. Imagine stepping back in time, not just a few decades or centuries, but several centuries, into a world both familiar and alien, where the clamor of modern life is replaced by the echo of footsteps on cobblestones, the creak of wooden gates, and the distant toll of church bells. It is a world where castles rise from the misty hills, their stone walls stretching high into the sky, and where wealth, power, and influence are displayed in grand halls glittering with gold, tapestries, and precious jewels. At first glance, this might appear to be the dream of every modern observer, a life of comfort, luxury, and abundance, far removed from the struggles of common folk who toil from sunrise to sunset merely to survive. But behind this shimmering facade of wealth, the life of a rich individual in medieval times was far more complex, nuanced, and in many ways perilous than we often imagine. To truly understand what it meant to be wealthy in this era, one must step beyond the glitter and enter the rhythms, routines, and realities of medieval life. Consider, first, the very spaces that the wealthy inhabited. Castles, the ultimate symbols of medieval affluence and authority, were feats of both engineering and intimidation. Their massive walls, towers, and battlements were designed not merely to impress visitors, but to protect inhabitants from threats both near and far. Moats carved into the earth reflected the sky like liquid silver, while drawbridges allowed controlled access, a reminder that safety and vulnerability coexisted in fragile equilibrium. Within these walls lay spacious halls, where sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, painting the stone floors in patterns of color. The air carried a mixture of fragrances, the scent of burning logs in massive hearths, the aroma of roasted meats and spiced sauces, and occasionally the less pleasant odors of animals, human activity, and the inadequate sanitation systems of the time. Yet all these details formed the backdrop of a life where every element, from the architecture to the furnishings, spoke of status, control, and wealth. The daily life of a rich medieval individual was both structured and intense. Unlike the romanticized depictions of idle nobles reclining at banquets, their existence was governed by a web of obligations, rituals, and responsibilities. From the earliest hours of the day, one's schedule was dictated by necessity as much as by prestige. Morning might begin with religious observances, a quiet moment of reflection and prayer to secure divine favor, a crucial consideration in a society where the divine and the temporal were intimately connected. Clergy and advisors would often guide these rituals, ensuring that both spiritual and social expectations were met. Afterward, one's attention would turn to the administration of estates. Wealth in medieval times was rarely just a measure of personal comfort. It was an active force that needed careful management. Landowners oversaw large tracts of land, each with its own peasants, craftsmen, and laborers. Decisions about crop rotation, resource allocation, and taxation were constant, and the wrong choice could have devastating consequences for both the wealth holder and those dependent on them. But wealth was not merely about land and resources. It was a symbol of power, influence, and prestige. Clothing, for example, was a language in itself, communicating social rank before a word was spoken. Rich fabrics like silk, velvet, and brocade were not simply decorative, but carefully chosen to signal status. Jewelry adorned the fingers, necks, and clothing, of the affluent, reflecting light in ways that seemed almost magical to those who had never seen such opulence. Every accessory, every piece of attire, carried meaning, and failing to present oneself according to social expectations could be interpreted as a lapse in taste, influence, or authority. Appearance was more than vanity. It was a form of currency, a visual assertion of one's position in the rigid hierarchy of medieval society. The experience of wealth extended to food, an area often romanticized yet fraught with hidden challenges. Banquets were the pinnacle of social display. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, exotic spices, pastries, and fruits brought from distant land. The feasts were sensory spectacles, the sight of glistening meats, the aroma of fresh, baked bread, the sound of minstrels playing in the background, and the taste of flavors both familiar and foreign. Yet such abundance carried risks. The very foods that symbolized prosperity could lead to health problems, a reality poorly understood at the time. Excessive consumption of rich foods often resulted in digestive troubles, gout, and other illnesses. Hygiene and food safety were rudimentary, so even the most extravagant meal could harbor unseen dangers. Each bite was simultaneously a pleasure and a gamble, a reminder that wealth could not entirely shield one from the fragility of the human body. Even leisure, often imagined as effortless, was structured and laden with expectation. Hunting trips, falconry, and horseback riding were not only recreational but social exercises, demonstrating skill, bravery, and control over both land and animals. Music, dancing, and storytelling formed another facet of aristocratic life, providing entertainment while reinforcing cultural and familial bonds. Yet within all these moments of apparent ease, subtle pressures lingered. Social interactions were never entirely genuine. Every conversation, every gesture could carry political significance or influence alliances. Trust was a rare commodity. The rich often found themselves surrounded by people who sought personal gain, flattery, or access to influence, making even casual interactions a careful dance of observation, strategy, and sometimes deception. Political and familial considerations further complicated life. Marriages, alliances, and negotiations were rarely purely romantic. They were strategic maneuvers that could elevate a family's status or secure critical resources. The wealthy lived in a world where loyalty was fragile, where an ally today might become a threat tomorrow. Even relatives, bound by blood, could harbor ambitions that made kinship a delicate affair. In this environment, wealth was a double-edged sword. It granted influence and comfort, yet it also attracted envy, manipulation, and danger. A lavish lifestyle could invite attacks, lawsuits, or conspiracies, reminding the wealthy that every advantage carried a cost. In the quiet of the evening, when the halls of the castle were lit by flickering torches and the sounds of the day subsided, the duality of medieval wealth became most apparent. While the surroundings spoke of power, abundance, and prestige, an undercurrent of vigilance persisted. Every shadow in the corridor could conceal a threat. Every knock at the door might herald a visitor with motives unknown. Security was never just a matter of physical protection. It was a state of constant awareness, a mental burden carried alongside material riches. Even sleep, the one refuge of all humans, could be tempered by the knowledge that fortune and status were fragile, easily disrupted by forces beyond one's control. Wealth in medieval times also came with expectations that extended beyond survival and security. Generosity and patronage were markers of social status, requiring the rich to sponsor religious institutions, public works, and cultural endeavors. These acts, while enhancing reputation, also demanded resources, energy, and careful planning. Failure to meet societal expectations could damage prestige, while overextension could endanger the very wealth one sought to protect. Thus, a rich person's life was a complex tapestry woven from privilege, responsibility, and constant negotiation with the world around them. Even the psychological dimension of wealth cannot be overlooked. The knowledge that one's prosperity made one both envied and resented created an ongoing tension. The isolation born of privilege, the vigilance required for safety, the relentless demands of social expectation, all these factors contributed to a subtle, persistent anxiety. While the rich might enjoy comforts unimaginable to ordinary people, they were seldom free from the mental and emotional burdens that accompanied their status. The gilded walls, the fine fabrics, the abundance of food, and the beauty of the environment could not fully shield them from the pressures, fears, and complexities of their world. In essence, the life of the wealthy in medieval times was defined by contrast. It was a world of abundance intertwined with vulnerability, of beauty shadowed by risk, of comfort tempered by responsibility. Every privilege came with a price, every indulgence with a hidden hazard, every alliance with potential betrayal. The glittering exterior of wealth concealed a labyrinth of challenges, dangers, and delicate balances. To truly grasp the experience of medieval affluence, one must look beyond the surface, embracing both the allure and the shadow that defined it. As night falls over the medieval landscape, one can imagine the grand halls settling into quiet, the flickering torches casting dancing shadows, and the wealthy lying awake in their luxurious chambers, aware that even in abundance, life remained precarious, unpredictable, and, in its own way, fragile. And it is within this tension between beauty and danger, comfort and vigilance, that the story of medieval wealth unfolds, inviting us to explore not just the material trappings, but the profound human experience of living at the height of privilege in a world filled with uncertainty. Imagine a world where the very possession of wealth transforms the air you breathe into something both intoxicating and dangerous. To be rich in medieval times was to stand on a pinnacle that few could ever reach, yet it was also to balance precariously on a ledge exposed to winds of envy, betrayal, and ambition. Wealth, in this era, was not merely a measure of comfort or influence. It was a magnet, drawing attention, desire, and sometimes malice from all directions. To hold it was to be constantly aware that your fortune, your family, and even your life could be claimed, contested, or destroyed by forces both near and far. The price of power, it turns out, was far greater than the mere acquisition of gold or land. Consider the structure of medieval society itself, where hierarchy dictated every interaction and every decision. Kings and nobles ruled vast territories, and their power rested on wealth, military strength, and strategic alliances. A wealthy landowner or noble family wielded influence not only through their possessions, but also through the networks they maintained. Every ally was a potential source of support, every friend a possible mediator, and every neighbor a potential rival. The interconnectedness of these relationships meant that a single misstep, a poorly chosen alliance, a perceived slight, a misunderstood action, could ripple outward with consequences that might take months or years to manifest. Unlike today, where legal systems can provide some measure of protection, the medieval world operated on a mixture of honor, loyalty, and fear, leaving the wealthy constantly vigilant. To live in a grand castle was both privilege and prison. From the outside, the thick walls, soaring towers, and fortified gates projected an image of invincibility. They symbolized status, strength, and security. Yet within these same walls, the wealthy faced threats that were not always external. Political intrigue was a constant companion, woven into the fabric of daily life. Advisors, relatives, and courtiers each had their own agendas, some aligned with the interests of the household, and some entirely self-serving. Secrets were currency, whispers were weapons, and trust was a rare commodity. One could dine in a hall illuminated by torchlight and yet feel a tension that made each glance and gesture fraught with meaning. Conversations were often carefully constructed, words chosen as much for their strategic value as for their clarity or warmth. In such an environment, even the act of eating a meal in company became a delicate exercise in observation, discernment, and caution. The threat of betrayal was never hypothetical. History is filled with tales of wealthy families brought to ruin by those closest to them. Relatives could turn against one another in pursuit of inheritance or favor, neighbors might plot to seize lands, and rivals could exploit any lapse in judgment to advance their own position. These were not idle dangers, they were real and often deadly. Political assassinations, sudden uprisings, and violent disputes over territory were common occurrences. To be wealthy was to be a target, to hold a position that demanded constant awareness of who might be observing, scheming, or waiting for a moment of weakness. Every step outside the castle gates, every interaction with other nobles or officials carried potential risk. Even trusted servants could be co-opted, bribed, or coerced into acting against their master. The price of power, therefore, was a life lived in perpetual alertness, where vigilance was not optional but essential. Alliances, both political and familial, were key to maintaining security and influence. Marriages were often arranged with careful consideration of how they could enhance wealth, consolidate land, or create strategic bonds, but even these alliances were precarious. A family that seemed loyal today might change allegiances tomorrow, influenced by the shifting tides of power, the promise of greater advantage, or simple greed. Negotiations were continuous, subtle, and sometimes dangerous. The wealthy had to be adept at reading motives, assessing character, and predicting the behavior of those around them. A miscalculation could not only cost money or property, but could endanger lives. Even celebrations or ceremonial events were stages upon which political maneuvering occurred. Every smile, bow, and toast could be interpreted as a signal of loyalty, submission, or defiance. In such a world, the wealthy learned early that power was never given freely, and it was never secure. It was a force to be constantly managed, defended, and, when necessary, fought for. Military power was another dimension of this precarious balance. Wealth allowed one to maintain armies, train knights, and fortify castles, but it also made one a target in times of conflict. Wars were frequent, whether motivated by territorial disputes, succession crises, or regional rivalries. A wealthy landowner might be called upon to supply soldiers, provide funds, or personally lead men into battle. Even in times of peace, the potential for conflict required constant preparation. Castles were designed not merely for comfort, but for defense, with battlements, arrow slits, and hidden passages serving as reminders that safety was never guaranteed. Every moment of relaxation was tinged with the knowledge that danger could arrive unannounced, whether in the form of invading forces, insurrection among subjects, or betrayal from within. Social perception was another invisible but powerful factor. The wealthy lived in a world where reputation was everything. Their actions, decisions, and associations were scrutinized not only by peers, but also by those who sought to undermine them. Rumors could spread quickly, misinterpretations could lead to conflict, and envy could manifest in actions intended to harm or diminish one's standing. The rich were acutely aware that their wealth drew attention in ways that were both flattering and threatening. While common folk might struggle with basic survival, the wealthy struggled with a different kind of survival: the preservation of influence, respect, and security in a world where every advantage attracted both admiration and envy. Even routine activities were shadowed by risk. Traveling from one estate to another required careful planning, armed escorts, and knowledge of the terrain. Roads could be dangerous, patrolled by bandits or contested by rival factions. Merchants, messengers, and envoys carried messages and goods that could easily become points of contention. The wealthy had to navigate not only physical dangers, but also the intricate web of social and political expectations, ensuring that their movements and communications did not inadvertently provoke hostility or suspicion. Each journey, each decision, each interaction became a careful calculation in a world where one misstep could have far-reaching consequences. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance cannot be overstated. Wealth brought comfort, luxury, and influence, but it also brought anxiety, stress, and a persistent awareness of vulnerability. The knowledge that one's prosperity could attract enemies, disrupt alliances, or incite envy created a mental burden that was never far from the mind. Sleep might come fitfully, with thoughts of threats, responsibilities, and potential betrayals lingering even in the quiet hours of the night. The life of the rich was not merely a life of indulgence. It was a life of heightened awareness, strategic thinking, and, above all, caution. Even within the family, the dynamics of power created tension. Heirs, siblings, and extended relatives were often involved in negotiations and disputes over inheritance, marriage prospects, and political influence. The wealthy had to manage these relationships carefully, ensuring that ambition did not become destructive, that alliances remained strong, and that loyalty was maintained. Family gatherings, though outwardly celebratory, were often tinged with undercurrents of strategy and subtle competition. Every gesture, every word, could carry implications that extended far beyond the immediate moment, reinforcing the reality that power was both a privilege and a weighty responsibility. In essence, the experience of wealth in medieval times was defined by duality. The privileges of power, luxury, influence, and prestige were inseparable from the responsibilities, dangers, and vigilance they demanded. Wealth was not a guarantee of safety or comfort. It was a condition that required constant management, awareness, and adaptation. The richer one became, the greater the potential rewards, but also the sharper the risks. Every success carried the seeds of potential downfall. Every advantage attracted attention that could become dangerous, and every opportunity for comfort was intertwined with the need for caution. At the end of the day, in the quiet of a candlelit chamber, the wealthy might gaze out over their lands, the flickering light casting long shadows across stone floors and tapestries. The beauty, the power, and the influence they enjoyed were real, yet they were always tempered by the awareness that the very things they possessed could also threaten them. The price of power was vigilance, strategy, and constant awareness. A life in which the glitter of gold and the grandeur of castles were inseparable from the ever-present specter of danger. To be wealthy in medieval times was to live with one foot in comfort and the other in caution, to balance the rewards of influence against the risks of envy, betrayal, and conflict. It was a life defined not only by what one owned, but by what one had to protect, defend, and navigate at every moment. The richness of the world, the beauty of the surroundings, and the power of position were inseparable from the vigilance required to maintain them. And this duality, this intricate balance, defined the true experience of wealth in an age both magnificent and perilous. Imagine the life of a wealthy medieval individual, the grand halls, the glimmering chandeliers, the carefully arranged feasts, and the silks and velvets that adorned their bodies. On the surface, it seems as though such a life is free from the burdens that plague the ordinary person. But behind the splendor lies an unexpected and often overlooked reality: the pursuit of luxury, the indulgence in abundance, and the very comforts that wealth affords carry within them hidden dangers, particularly to health. In medieval times, prosperity brought not only prestige and influence, but also unique and sometimes severe risks that were invisible, insidious, and ever present. Consider the diet of the rich. Unlike the common folk, whose meals were primarily composed of bread, vegetables, and occasionally some protein, the wealthy could afford meats of every variety, imported spices, sugar from distant lands, and an abundance of preserved foods that were otherwise inaccessible. On feast days, tables would be laden with roasted game, fresh fish, poultry, cheeses, pies, and pastries dripping with honey or sugared icing. Exotic spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper were not just culinary embellishments, but markers of status and refinement. The aroma of such a feast would fill the halls, tempting both the senses and the appetite. Yet these very indulgences carried consequences that the medieval medical knowledge of the time could scarcely manage. The health risks of such a diet were multifaceted. Gout, often called the rich man's disease, became a common affliction among nobles and the wealthy. It was caused by excessive consumption of meats and alcohol, particularly wine, which were staples of a high-status diet. Those who suffered from gout experienced painful inflammation, primarily in the joints, often leading to chronic discomfort and even debilitation. Obesity was another frequent outcome of dietary excess, and it brought with it a host of complications: reduced mobility, cardiovascular strain, and an overall vulnerability to illness. While the wealthy could indulge freely, their very lifestyle became a source of slow, creeping illness, an ironic consequence of the abundance meant to symbolize their superiority and comfort. Beyond dietary concerns, sanitation, or rather the lack thereof, posed significant hazard. Even in grand castles, medieval plumbing was rudimentary at best. Latrines were often positioned over rivers or cesspits, while bathing was irregular and sometimes regarded with suspicion, especially in certain climates and periods. Water, even in the most carefully maintained households, could be contaminated, carrying bacteria that led to gastrointestinal infections and other ailments. Even the most sumptuous banquet could become a source of illness if food was improperly stored, handled, or cooked. Meat might spoil without detection, bread could harbor mold, and dishes might be contaminated by insects or rodents. The very act of indulging in luxury, therefore, brought with it risks invisible to the eye, threats that wealth alone could not entirely mitigate. Medical knowledge in medieval times was limited, largely based on humoral theory, the belief that the body's health depended on the balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Physicians prescribed treatments that might seem strange or even dangerous to modern ears: bloodletting, purging, and the application of various herbs and concoctions, some toxic. The wealthy, who had access to physicians and elaborate remedies, were not immune to error. A misdiagnosis, an ineffective treatment, or an overzealous application of remedies could easily worsen an already delicate condition. Ironically, the very attention that wealth allowed in terms of medical care did not always translate into better outcomes. It sometimes introduced new risks. The living environment itself also carried hidden health challenges. Castles and manors, while imposing and impressive, were not designed with modern ventilation or hygiene standards in mind. Smoke from large hearths filled rooms, creating respiratory strain. Stone walls retained dampness, contributing to mold growth that could affect lungs and skin. Rodents and insects drawn to stored grains, food supplies, and waste, were vectors of disease capable of transmitting illnesses that could rapidly affect an entire household. Even the servants and staff, vital to maintaining the comforts of the household, could inadvertently introduce pathogens, carrying infections from outside the castle walls. Another hidden danger was the psychological and physical impact of social expectations. Wealthy individuals were expected to attend numerous feasts, ceremonies, and social events, often requiring long journeys, exposure to the elements, and extended periods of strain. These obligations, though outwardly pleasurable, taxed both the body and the mind. Fatigue could lower immunity, making one more susceptible to infections that might otherwise be manageable. The need to maintain appearances, to display vitality and composure in every social interaction, added an invisible weight to the already complex and hazardous life of the affluent. Hunting, a favored pastime of the wealthy, combined leisure with physical exertion, but also carried its own risks. Chasing game across uneven terrain, handling weapons, and traveling through forests and open fields exposed nobles to falls, injuries, and sometimes deadly encounters with wild animals. Hunting trips were also social events where food and drink were consumed in excess, compounding dietary hazards with physical risk. Even seemingly pleasurable activities thus intersected with health concerns, illustrating the delicate balance between indulgence and vulnerability. Plagues and epidemics added another layer of peril. Wealth did not guarantee immunity. During outbreaks, the rich were often the first targets, as their frequent interactions, domestic arrangements, and social obligations created opportunities for disease to spread. The Black Death, which would later ravage Europe, highlighted the vulnerability of all social classes, demonstrating that wealth could provide comfort and resources, but not ultimate protection against nature's most indiscriminate threats. Even absent a pandemic, seasonal illnesses such as influenza, smallpox, and dysentery were constant threats, their severity magnified by a lack of effective treatments. Clothing, while a symbol of status, also had implications for health. Rich fabrics such as silk and wool, often dyed with chemical substances, could irritate the skin or carry insects. Heavy garments restricted movement and contributed to overheating or discomfort, particularly in the warm months. Jewelry, though decorative, sometimes contained lead or other materials that could lead to poisoning over prolonged contact. Thus, the very markers of affluence, intended to display prestige and taste, were often double-edged, enhancing appearance while introducing subtle physical risks. Sleep, another essential component of health, was also affected by wealth. The wealthy had access to softer beds, furs, and cushions, yet their chambers were often drafty, damp, or infested with insects. The noise from servants, guards, and animals could interrupt rest, while the psychological burdens of managing estates, maintaining status, and safeguarding wealth created anxiety that disturbed slumber. Even in the comfort of luxurious surroundings, the affluent were not immune to the physiological and mental effects of stress, fatigue, and worry, demonstrating once again that privilege could not fully shield one from the realities of human vulnerability. Travel, too, was fraught with risk. Wealthy individuals frequently moved between estates, attended courts, or visited distant lands for trade or diplomacy. Roads were uneven and dangerous, bandits were common, and weather could create treacherous conditions. Travel required armed escorts and careful planning, yet accidents, injuries, and illness were always a possibility. Even when safely arrived, the change in climate, exposure to unfamiliar foods, and interaction with new populations could introduce pathogens against which the body had little defense. The cumulative effect of these factors was that wealth in medieval times carried a paradox. The more abundant the resources, the greater the potential for hidden danger. While comfort, luxury, and status were real, they existed alongside vulnerabilities that could affect the body and mind in subtle and profound ways. The richness of life, the pleasures of abundance, and the displays of power and prestige were inseparable from the hazards they introduced, creating a continuous balancing act between indulgence and well-being. Ultimately, the health risks of wealth in medieval times remind us that prosperity, however dazzling, was never without its costs. Every meal, every feast, every indulgence was both pleasure and potential peril. Every architectural marvel, every luxurious garment, every ornate accessory carried hidden hazards. The wealthy were constantly navigating an intricate web of visible and invisible threats, balancing comfort with caution and indulgence with vigilance. The glittering halls, the sumptuous food, and the elaborate ceremonies all concealed a complex reality. That wealth, for all its advantages, was inseparable from the vulnerabilities it introduced. And so, as candlelight flickers across the walls of a grand medieval hall, as servants move quietly to prepare for the evening, and as the wealthy retire to their chambers after a day of indulgence and obligation, the truth becomes clear. Luxury, abundance, and status are not guarantees of safety or health. The very life of comfort they sought and achieved carried within it hidden risks, a quiet but persistent reminder that even the most privileged were subject to the frailty of the human body, the unpredictability of disease, and the subtle dangers woven into a life of abundance. In the quiet of the night, one can almost hear the gentle rustle of silk, the faint creaking of bed frames, and the muted footsteps of attendants, all set against a backdrop of shadows cast by flickering torchlight. It is in this environment that the wealthy slept, dreamt, and sometimes suffered, aware, perhaps only subconsciously, that their privileges carried with them an array of unseen hazards. Each breath, each movement, each meal, and each interaction was part of a delicate equilibrium, where the rewards of luxury were inseparable from the responsibilities, vulnerabilities, and health risks it entailed. Even as we reflect centuries later, imagining ourselves wandering these grand halls or sitting at overflowing feasting tables, it becomes evident that wealth in medieval times was a complex tapestry of abundance and danger. The more one had, the more one had to guard, manage, and navigate, not only against external threats, but against the subtle, creeping vulnerabilities that affluence itself created. And it is within this delicate balance between indulgence and risk, comfort and fragility, that the story of medieval wealth and health unfolds, offering a window into the lived experience of a world both magnificent and perilous. Imagine for a moment the life of a wealthy individual in medieval times, not merely in terms of material abundance, but in terms of the social environment that wealth created. While we often romanticize wealth as a source of endless companionship, lively gatherings, and constant admiration, the reality for medieval nobles and affluent landowners was far more complex. Wealth afforded privileges and luxuries, certainly, but it also created a kind of social isolation that is difficult for the modern imagination to fully grasp. The life of the rich was one of abundance in material terms, but paradoxically, of subtle scarcity in human connection. To understand this, one must look beyond the glittering surfaces of castles, feasts, and clothing, and explore the invisible walls that wealth often built around those who possessed it. Within the walls of a medieval castle, the wealthy lived surrounded by a network of people, each performing their own role. Servants and staff ensured comfort and convenience, The kitchens operated day and night to prepare food, the chambers were maintained with care, and every request, from the lighting of candles to the arrangement of furniture, was attended to. Advisors, stewards, and ministers managed lands, finances, and political connections. Guests, visiting dignitaries, and other members of the nobility arrived for feasts, ceremonies, or negotiations. On the surface, this might seem like a bustling, social environment, full of human interaction. Yet, in reality, much of it was transactional, structured, and laden with expectation. Genuine companionship was rare, friendships were often strategic, alliances carefully calculated, and every relationship potentially influenced by ambition, envy, or necessity. The wealthy lived in a world where appearances mattered immensely and trust was scarce. The very architecture of castles reinforced this sense of isolation. Thick stone walls, towers, and gates were designed for protection, projecting strength and security to outsiders. Yet these same walls created separation from the world beyond. Courtyards, gates, and drawbridges served as physical reminders that even in times of peace, the wealthy were set apart. The nearest neighbor might be a rival, a relative with claims to property, or a visiting noble with hidden agendas. The people within the walls could be numerous, but each came with their own role, their own motives, and their own limitations. Solitude, in the midst of plenty, was a constant companion. The wealthy might walk through expansive halls, surrounded by attendants and advisors, yet feel a profound sense of aloneness, a separation not imposed by distance, but by the very structure of privilege and power. Social gatherings, too, were double-edged. Banquets, balls, and feasts were central to the lives of the wealthy, designed to display status, reinforce alliances, and entertain the senses. Long tables groaned under the weight of meats, breads, fruits, and exotic delicacies, while minstrels played music and jesters entertained with humor and acrobatics. Guests engaged in conversation that was often polite but measured, careful not to offend, overstep, or betray ignorance of the social hierarchy. The wealthy could observe, participate, and even enjoy these gatherings, but genuine connection was limited. Every smile, every word, every gesture could be interpreted through a lens of political or social significance. To misstep, even unintentionally, was to risk embarrassment, the erosion of reputation, or the loss of advantage. Social interaction, therefore, while abundant in frequency and spectacle, was often constrained by rules, expectation, and the subtle calculations required to navigate a world where every relationship had consequences. Family life, too, carried its own complexities. Large households were common, with extended family members living under the same roof or nearby estates. Marriages, alliances, and inheritance disputes were constant considerations, creating a tension between love, loyalty, and strategy. Children of noble families were educated, trained, and prepared to inherit not only wealth, but the responsibilities, obligations, and challenges that accompanied it. Yet even within families, genuine emotional intimacy could be complicated. Parents, spouses, and siblings were often involved in negotiations, strategic alliances, or the pursuit of influence, which sometimes meant that affection was tempered by consideration of duty or advantage. The wealthy were surrounded by people, yet those closest to them were not always free from ambition, creating layers of subtle isolation. The isolation imposed by wealth was further reinforced by mobility and geography. Estates could span vast distances, and castles were often located on elevated terrain, separated from villages, forests, or neighboring estates. Travel between locations was not simple. It required planning, armed escorts, and careful consideration of safety. While this separation provided security, it also physically and socially isolated the wealthy from the broader population. Daily life unfolded in a relatively small circle of known individuals, limiting opportunities for spontaneous, genuine interaction with people outside the immediate sphere of influence. The rich could observe the wider world, but only from a distance, separated by walls, lands, and social barriers that kept them apart. Religious obligations also shaped social dynamics. Attendance at Mass, participation in ceremonies, and support of religious institutions were central to noble life. While these activities provided some social contact and reinforced a sense of belonging within a moral and spiritual framework, they also reinforced hierarchical structures and distinctions. Clergy, fellow nobles, and parishioners all played roles in maintaining order, but their presence was mediated by expectation, protocol, and social norms. Even in communal worship, interaction was constrained, formal, and defined by roles rather than genuine emotional equality. Spiritual life could offer solace, but it did not necessarily mitigate the sense of separation from others on a human, intimate level. Another dimension of social isolation stemmed from the need for constant vigilance. The wealthy were acutely aware of envy, rivalry, and potential betrayal. Every conversation, gesture, or display of wealth was observed by others, interpreted, and often evaluated in terms of advantage, threat, or loyalty. Friends could be opportunistic, neighbors covetous, and even loyal servants might be swayed by promises, bribes, or coercion. In such a context, it became difficult to relax fully or let one's guard down. Trust had to be measured carefully, and genuine intimacy became rare. The more one possessed, the more one was set apart, not only physically but emotionally and socially, from those around them. Even leisure and recreation carried constraints. Hunting, falconry, music, and games provided distraction and enjoyment. Yet these activities were often performed under observation, with expectation, or in a competitive context. Competence, skill, and appearance mattered, and failure could damage reputation or social standing. The rich could engage in play and pastime, but they could rarely do so entirely free from the pressures of perception. Every performance, every display of prowess was simultaneously a source of pleasure and a subtle reminder of isolation. The need to maintain composure, demonstrate skill, and assert status. Education and learning, while often advanced for the wealthy, also contributed to isolation. Tutors, scholars, and mentors provided knowledge, instruction, and guidance, yet the pursuit of learning separated the noble individual from those engaged in daily labor or ordinary life. Intellectual engagement was often solitary or limited to a select few peers, reinforcing the sense of a contained world in which the wealthy moved. Knowledge, while empowering, created a gap between the privileged and the broader population, a gap that was both material and social. Even in the intimacy of private chambers, isolation persisted. Sleep, personal reflection, and solitude were sometimes sought as relief from the constant demands of social obligation. Yet, within these moments of privacy, the awareness of responsibility, potential danger, and the limitations of trust often remained. The wealthy were rarely able to experience life entirely free from the pressures that their status imposed. The very privileges that allowed comfort, luxury, and security simultaneously created barriers to spontaneous, genuine, and egalitarian human connection. The paradox of wealth in medieval society becomes clear. The more one had, the more one was separated from ordinary human experiences of trust, intimacy, and ease. The wealthy were surrounded by people, yet emotionally and socially constrained by hierarchy, expectation, and the vigilance required to maintain position and security. Their interactions were mediated by roles, duty, and the careful calculation of advantage rather than free, unguarded relationships. The richness of their environment, the halls, the art, the clothing, the food, could not fully compensate for the subtle deprivation of authentic companionship. Moreover, the wealthy often experienced isolation not only from common people, but also from peers of similar status. Competition among nobles, fear of betrayal, and strategic positioning meant that alliances were often temporary, cautious, and calculated. Social gatherings could mask undercurrents of rivalry, and even the most seemingly friendly interactions could carry motives shaped by ambition or caution. In this sense, isolation was not merely a function of distance or security. It was woven into the very fabric of social life, influencing perception, behavior, and emotional experience. Throughout their lives, the wealthy learned to navigate these intricate social landscapes, balancing visibility and engagement with discretion and reserve. They cultivated relationships selectively, trusted cautiously, and measured their words and gestures in every setting. The consequences of miscalculation, whether in speech, alliance, or action, could be significant, reinforcing the sense that, despite abundance, genuine social connection was limited. The world of the rich was abundant in opportunity but constrained in intimacy, full of human presence but often lacking authentic, unmediated companionship. In the quiet of the night, as torches flickered and the castle settled into darkness, the social isolation of the wealthy could feel most pronounced. Surrounded by walls, servants, and advisors, they might still feel alone. Even the grand halls, the expansive courtyards, and the ornate chambers could not fully erase the subtle distance created by privilege, expectation, and vigilance. The isolation was not always overt or conscious, but it existed as a quiet, persistent reality shaping thought, behavior, and emotional life. Thus, the story of wealth in medieval times is not only one of power, abundance, and luxury, but also of separation, caution, and the subtle weight of social isolation. The more one possessed, the more careful one had to be, and the more constrained one became in the very human sphere of trust, intimacy, and companionship. The life of the wealthy was, in many ways, gilded, beautiful, and spectacular, but it was also a life bounded by walls, both physical and emotional, by rules, obligations, and the unspoken understanding that true connection was rare and precious. Even as we imagine the grandeur of medieval life, the glittering tapestries, the flickering torches, the sumptuous feasts, and the echo of voices through stone halls, we can sense the quiet presence of isolation, like a shadow that stretches across every chamber and courtyard. The wealthy moved through a world designed for protection and prestige, yet in doing so, they often found themselves set apart from the natural flow of human life. Their abundance created boundaries as much as it created comfort, separating them from the spontaneity, equality, and ease of ordinary interaction. And so, in reflecting on the social isolation of the wealthy, we begin to see a richer, more nuanced picture of medieval life, a life in which material privilege and human separation were intertwined, where abundance came with its own limitations, and where the quiet spaces of solitude were as defining as the grand halls of feasts and celebration. In this delicate balance, one finds the hidden cost of wealth, a cost that was often invisible, felt not in physical discomfort or hunger, but in the subtle, pervasive, and enduring experience of being surrounded yet profoundly alone. Imagine, for a moment, the life of a wealthy individual in medieval times, not merely in terms of material abundance or social prestige, but in the weight of the responsibilities that accompanied their wealth. Unlike the modern conception of riches, which often emphasizes freedom, leisure, and personal choice, medieval wealth was inseparable from duty, expectation, and constant oversight. Every coin, every parcel of land, every household, and every title carried obligations that demanded attention, foresight, and wisdom. The very comforts and privileges that wealth afforded were intricately entwined with duties that could be relentless, consuming, and sometimes perilous. The first and perhaps most visible dimension of responsibility was the management of estates. Land was the primary source of wealth in medieval society, and it was far from a passive asset. Vast tracts of farmland, forests, rivers, and pastures needed to be supervised, maintained, and defended. Crops had to be planted and harvested in accordance with seasons and weather. Livestock needed care and protection, and resources such as timber, minerals, and water required careful management. Decisions about these matters were rarely straightforward. A misjudgment about crop rotation could lead to famine for tenants or financial loss for the landowner. A neglected forest might become overgrown, decreasing its usefulness for timber or hunting. The stakes were high, and the margin for error was often slim. Every choice, however small it seemed, could ripple outward, affecting the lives of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people dependent on the estate for survival. Alongside agricultural management came financial responsibility. Taxes had to be collected, rents accounted for, and trade arrangements maintained. The wealthy often relied on stewards and accountants to oversee these operations, yet ultimate accountability rested on their shoulders. An estate could not flourish if mismanaged, and the fortunes of a family were fragile. Even in times of prosperity, the constant need to monitor finances, evaluate contracts, and ensure the loyalty and efficiency of subordinates created a persistent mental and emotional burden. Wealth required vigilance. It could not simply be enjoyed passively. Military obligations further complicated life. Many wealthy individuals were also nobles, bound by fealty to kings or higher-ranking lords. This bond carried the expectation of providing soldiers, resources, or personal leadership in times of conflict. Wars, skirmishes, and feuds were common, and the wealthy were often required to participate directly or indirectly. Maintaining trained men-at-arms, equipping soldiers, and ensuring loyalty among retainers was a complex task that demanded constant attention. Even in periods of peace, preparation for potential conflict was necessary. Castles had to be fortified, defenses maintained, and plans for mobilization devised. The burden of ensuring security for one's own family, estate, and dependents was a constant, invisible pressure that accompanied every aspect of life. Political responsibilities were equally weighty. Alliances, both formal and informal, had to be cultivated and maintained. The wealthy were expected to participate in councils, negotiate disputes, and offer counsel or support to rulers. Diplomacy, persuasion, and the careful management of relationships were critical skills. One misstep in communication or judgment could erode influence, invite rivalry, or even provoke retaliation. In an era where reputation was paramount, the consequences of failing to act wisely extended beyond personal loss. They could threaten family legacy, estate stability, and social standing for generations. Political responsibility was not merely a task. It was a pervasive aspect of existence, shaping decisions, movements, and even personal behavior at all times. Family obligations added yet another layer of complexity. The wealthy were responsible for the well-being, training, and alliances of their children. Sons often received military or administrative training, preparing to inherit and manage estates. Daughters were frequently educated in etiquette, language, and household management, with marriage often arranged to secure strategic alliances or increase influence. Every family member's life and future was interwoven with social and political strategy, creating a constant web of duties that the wealthy had to monitor and orchestrate. The pressure to maintain family honor and ensure successful succession was immense. A mismanaged inheritance, an ill-advised marriage, or a poorly trained heir could compromise not only the family's wealth, but its very position in society. Social obligations were also continuous and consuming. The wealthy were expected to host feasts, celebrate holidays, and attend ceremonies that reinforced social bonds and displayed status. These events required careful planning, preparation, and oversight. The food, entertainment, accommodations, and presentation of guests all reflected on the host's skill, taste, and influence. A poorly executed banquet or an overlooked guest could damage reputation or provoke resentment. Even leisure and celebration were entwined with duty, transforming moments of potential relaxation into exercises in responsibility and strategic attention. Religious obligations added yet another dimension to the life of the wealthy. Nobles and affluent landowners were expected to support churches, monasteries, and religious institutions through donations, patronage, and construction projects. These acts of piety were not purely spiritual. They reinforced social standing and influence. Overseeing these responsibilities required careful management of resources, negotiation with clergy, and attention to the expectations of both faith and society. Failing in these duties could be interpreted as both moral and social failing, creating pressure that extended beyond material or political concerns. Even seemingly private decisions carried broader consequences. Choices about personal behavior, travel, and association had implications for reputation, security, and social standing. The wealthy were constantly observed, and their actions were interpreted, judged, and often emulated. This scrutiny created a psychological weight that was ever present, a quiet awareness that even a minor lapse could have repercussions far beyond the immediate moment. Every action, every word, and every decision was part of a delicate balance between personal desire and social expectation. The physical burden of responsibility was equally significant. Maintaining estates, overseeing construction, traveling between properties, attending councils, and managing armed forces required energy, stamina, and constant attention. The wealthy could delegate many tasks, yet ultimate accountability remained theirs. Even with servants, stewards, and advisors, the physical demands of overseeing complex operations and ensuring security could be exhausting. The combination of mental vigilance, emotional investment, and physical exertion created a life of perpetual engagement, a life in which even rest and leisure were framed by duty. The psychological impact of this burden cannot be overstated. The wealthy were acutely aware that any failure, whether in judgment, management, or social conduct, could have cascading consequences. Stress, anxiety, and constant mental calculation were part of daily existence. Decisions had to account for the welfare of dependents, the expectations of peers and rulers, and the potential reactions of rivals. The life of privilege was inseparable from the life of responsibility, creating a constant tension between enjoyment of abundance and the careful management of its implications. Even seemingly minor events could carry disproportionate weight. A poor harvest could threaten both income and the well-being of tenants. A dispute with a neighboring noble could escalate into violence or legal conflict. Illness or injury within the family could disrupt carefully laid plans for succession or alliance. Every contingency had to be anticipated, every outcome considered, and every decision weighed for both immediate and long-term impact. The wealthy were perpetually engaged in an intricate balancing act, negotiating risks, responsibilities, and expectations simultaneously. Social expectations amplified the burden. Nobles and affluent landowners were expected to exhibit leadership, wisdom, and generosity. They were to be patrons of the arts, protectors of the vulnerable, and exemplars of virtue. Failure in any of these realms could erode influence, invite criticism, or provoke envy and rivalry. Even when acting with the best intentions, the wealthy had to consider how actions would be perceived, interpreted, and responded to by a complex network of peers, dependents, and rivals. This layer of scrutiny added an invisible but persistent weight to every choice and movement. The management of personal relationships was no less complex. Allies, relatives, and subordinates each had expectations, needs, and ambitions that had to be acknowledged and managed. Balancing competing demands required diplomacy, insight, and careful judgment. Trust, loyalty, and cooperation were valuable but often fragile commodities, and mismanagement could have immediate and long-term consequences. The wealthy lived in a world in which even personal interactions were governed by the intricate web of responsibility that defined their social and economic position. Education, too, was part of responsibility. The wealthy often had access to tutors, mentors, and scholarly resources that could enhance their knowledge, leadership, and management skills. Yet this education was itself a duty. To master administration, strategy, language, etiquette, and law was a lifelong task. Knowledge could empower, but it also increased awareness of risk and obligation, reinforcing the constant engagement required to navigate the complex world of wealth and status. Even leisure, often imagined as carefree, was entwined with duty. Hunting, falconry, tournaments, and other pursuits were opportunities to demonstrate skill, assert authority, and reinforce social bonds. Yet they required planning, oversight, and careful attention to safety and perception. The wealthy could enjoy pleasure and recreation, but these activities were rarely entirely free from the obligations of preparation, responsibility, and social expectation. Every experience, from feasting to travel to sport, was framed by the ever-present need to manage outcomes, appearances, and influence. In essence, the life of the wealthy in medieval times was a continuous exercise in responsibility. Every privilege, comfort, and source of abundance brought with it layers of duty, oversight, and accountability. Wealth did not free one from concern, it amplified it. The more one possessed, the more there was to manage, protect, and oversee. Every day was structured around obligations that extended from the personal to the familial, social, political, and spiritual realms. The wealthy navigated a delicate web of interrelated duties, in which failure in one domain could cascade into challenges in another, and in which success required constant vigilance, foresight, and resilience. The burden of responsibility was also psychological. Wealth created awareness of vulnerability, of the consequences of inaction or misjudgment, and of the delicate balance required to maintain position, security, and influence. Even in moments of solitude, reflection, or rest, the wealthy carried the mental weight of these responsibilities, anticipating challenges, planning strategies, and evaluating outcomes. The mind remained engaged even when the body rested, a testament to the inseparability of abundance and duty. Thus, the story of medieval wealth is not merely a tale of luxury, opulence, and influence. it is also a story of burden, a quiet, persistent, and encompassing weight that touched every aspect of life. Comfort, abundance, and privilege existed alongside duty, vigilance, and responsibility. The richness of the world created an intricate web of obligations, each demanding attention, care, and foresight. The wealthy navigated a world in which every choice, every action, and every decision carried significance, shaping the lives of dependents, family, and community alike. In the quiet of a candlelit chamber, as the household settles and torches flicker across tapestries, the wealthy may reflect on the day's decisions, the responsibilities yet to be managed, and the consequences of actions past. Even in the apparent ease of wealth, the weight of responsibility endures, silent, pervasive, and inescapable. To be rich in medieval times was not merely to enjoy comfort or status. It was to inhabit a life defined as much by duty as by privilege, a life in which abundance and responsibility were inseparable, and in which every privilege was accompanied by a careful, continuous management of obligation. As we reach the conclusion of our exploration into the life of wealth in medieval times, it becomes evident that riches, while dazzling and desirable, carried within them a hidden curse. The story of the wealthy is often told in terms of castles, opulent feasts, luxurious clothing, and social influence, but beneath the grandeur lies a complex reality. Wealth was as much a source of anxiety, danger, and burden as it was of comfort, prestige, and power. To understand this fully, one must look beyond the glittering surface and explore the intricate web of challenges, vulnerabilities, and responsibilities that define the lives of the rich in a world both magnificent and perilous. The hidden curse of wealth begins with vulnerability. Possessing abundant resources in medieval times automatically attracted attention, envy, and at times outright hostility. A wealthy noble could walk through a crowded town square, surrounded by attendants, armored guards, and visible symbols of power, yet each step carried potential risk. Peasants, bandits, and rival nobles alike were acutely aware of the opportunities that wealth presented, and their intentions ranged from admiration to covetousness, from subtle manipulation to violent aggression. Even allies could harbor ambitions of their own, waiting for a moment to advance personal agendas. In this environment, wealth was inseparable from danger, creating a constant undercurrent of tension and the need for vigilance that could never fully dissipate. Health, too, was compromised by abundance. The very comforts that signified wealth, exquisite diets, sumptuous clothing, and large households, introduced risks that were largely invisible. Overindulgence in rich foods led to diseases such as gout, obesity, and heart complications, while the materials used in clothing, jewelry, and furnishings sometimes introduced toxins or irritants. Hygiene, sanitation, and medical knowledge were limited, and even with access to physicians and remedies, the wealthy could not always avoid illness. Their lives, though outwardly comfortable, were inextricably linked to subtle physical vulnerabilities that wealth alone could not eliminate. The pursuit of luxury, intended to signify status and privilege, brought with it hidden, insidious threats to well-being. Social isolation compounded these challenges. Though wealthy individuals were surrounded by people, advisors, servants, family, and fellow nobles, the quality of their social interactions was often constrained by expectation, hierarchy, and vigilance. Genuine companionship was rare, as relationships were frequently transactional, strategic, or mediated by the necessity of reputation and power. Banquets, feasts, and ceremonies were opportunities for display and diplomacy, but they were not spaces in which one could fully relax or connect authentically. The wealthy moved in circles that were abundant in presence yet limited in intimacy, where trust was rare, loyalty was cautious, and the boundaries between friend, ally, and potential rival were often blurred. The hidden curse of wealth included not only the dangers of envy and illness, but also the quiet, persistent experience of social separation. Responsibility was perhaps the heaviest burden of all. Wealth required constant management and oversight of estates, finances, armies, alliances, and family. Every action had consequences. Every decision rippled outward, affecting the lives of others and the stability of power. Nobles and affluent landowners were bound by fealty, obligated to participate in military campaigns, political councils, and social duty. They were expected to act with wisdom, fairness, and foresight, not only for themselves, but for the well-being of their dependents and the preservation of legacy. Failure in any domain could threaten family honor, financial stability, or political influence. The larger one's holdings, the greater the scope of responsibility, and the more consuming the weight of vigilance became. Wealth, therefore, was inseparable from duty, and privilege came at the cost of relentless obligation. Even leisure was tinged with the hidden curse. Hunting, falconry, tournaments, and other pursuits provided distraction and enjoyment, but they also carried risk, demanded preparation, and reinforced social hierarchy. Displaying skill, maintaining appearances, and adhering to etiquette were inseparable from pleasure. A missed opportunity, a poorly executed action, or a lapse in judgment could affect reputation and influence. Wealth did not allow escape from engagement. It required active participation in every facet of life, from recreation to religious observance. Even the moments that seemed to modern eyes most carefree were threaded with obligation, performance, and subtle tension. Political intrigue added further dimensions to the hidden curse. Alliances could shift, friendships could be tested, and rivals could exploit any vulnerability. Wealth made one a target in ways that the average person could scarcely imagine. Even seemingly minor missteps could provoke feuds, legal disputes, or violent confrontations. Nobles had to navigate a world in which the rules were fluid, the stakes were high, and the outcomes were uncertain. To be rich in medieval times was to exist in a constant state of calculated awareness, balancing ambition, loyalty, and caution in a web of social and political complexity. Religious and moral expectations were additional layers of challenge. Wealth carried obligations to the church, monasteries, and charitable acts. The wealthy were expected to demonstrate piety, support spiritual institutions, and model virtue. Failure to meet these expectations could tarnish reputation, weaken alliances, or invite moral condemnation. Even acts of generosity were strategic as well as spiritual, reinforcing social standing and political influence. In this way, the spiritual dimension of wealth was intertwined with social and political responsibilities, reinforcing the hidden curse that abundance inevitably brought. Family life, too, was complicated by wealth. The management of heirs, marriages, and household dynamics required constant attention. Ensuring that children were prepared to inherit, that daughters were strategically married, and that relatives were satisfied with roles and rewards demanded foresight and diplomacy. Ambition, rivalry, and jealousy were persistent undercurrents, even within the most intimate of relationships. Wealth amplified these dynamics as the stakes were higher, the consequences more significant, and the potential for conflict greater. The household itself, while physically abundant and secure, was a complex social environment in which careful navigation was essential. The hidden curse extended to mental and emotional well-being. Wealth required constant vigilance, strategic thinking, and calculation. Every interaction, every decision, and every action was scrutinized, judged, or interpreted. Anxiety, stress, and the weight of responsibility were continuous companions. Even in solitude, the mind could not fully rest, for vigilance and foresight were integral to the preservation of estate, status, and family legacy. Sleep, though available in comfortable chambers, was often shadowed by worry, anticipation, and the mental tally of obligations. The more one possessed, the more one was aware of potential vulnerabilities, threats, and consequences. Physical risk also remained ever present. Travel, though luxurious compared to common standards, was hazardous. Roads were uneven, bandits frequent, and weather unpredictable. Journeys required armed escorts, careful planning, and constant attention. Even within fortified estates, accidents, falls, or structural